We see an attempt to quiet voices that speak different opinions that might not be the same opinion that we hold dear. We see leaders of institutions absolutely scared because their student population is acting just like students in college would, and yet these students are being attacked because they do not hold a viewpoint that those in power think is appropriate. We see a world order that sort of was very familiar to us suddenly break loose. The bonds of working together, of friendship, of a sense of unity are being destroyed. We're fearful for our own existence. Are we going to be able to make it as we enter into our retirement years? Wow, what's going to happen? What's going to happen with our health care? What's going to happen with our students who are poor and no longer have the ability to be fed every day? What happens with our young people? Our young people today are being bullied by their fellow students. They're being bullied for who they are. All of a sudden, we're determined as human beings in a binary way. We are either male or female. God forbid you see yourself any way other. And yet God has constantly done something different. God, in his wonderful sense of glory and majesty and thanksgiving and thankfulness, created a world that was not based upon sameness, but was celebrated in diversity. And the thing about diversity, God is so much smarter than we are, you know. Don't you hate to admit that? I thought I was pretty smart. I didn't hear you. What did you say?
I admit that proudly.
Oh, good for you. Oh, boy. But God is so much smarter than we are. Because God knew that in creating a world that was filled with diversity, we would also begin to find the wide expression of how we begin to approach and understand whom God really is. Wow. Yeah. What do we do today? I know we're frightened. We're uncertain. We don't know where to turn. And I think that this time is a particularly good time. It is a time of reflection, for it is the season of Lent. And that's what Lent is really about. It's about stepping back from our everyday busyness and taking time, one, to look at our relationship with God, and two, to look at our relationship with one another. It fits in with the great commandment that we just heard a couple of seconds ago. You shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy strength, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as whom? What was that? Yourself. Wow. That's a hard job, though, isn't it? What happens if we don't like ourselves? What happens if we feel lost? What happens if we feel that we're ostracized? What happens if we think we're the outsider? when we're filled with rage and uncertainty, when we are depressed, when we feel that we're picked upon, if we don't like ourselves too much because others don't like us, how can we even begin to appreciate a God who created us in God's image? And when God creates, God does one great thing right from the beginning. God looks at God's creation, and what does he do? He blesses it. This is good, and I bless you. Now, he didn't withhold his blessing from anybody or anything. My good neighbor here at one time, God did not forget to bless you, I don't think. Yeah. Just because you didn't cut your grass the way I wanted you to cut your grass when I was living in your neighborhood.
Oh, but mine was always the best.
Oh, yours was the best. I knew something was right. But see, we forget that in the busyness of our lives. And the thing is, we are distracted because we try to filter out the loud noises of prejudice and disconnectedness. Henry Nouwen, in a wonderful little book called Making All Things New, was talking about an invitation to a spiritual life. And that's what we're called to do this Lent, I believe. See? When we are preoccupied and worried and resentful, when we feel depressed, when we are lonely, when we face uncertainty, the major question we need to ask ourselves, how do we find God? And the first thing to do is to be willing to embrace our own sense of spirituality. And it's different from anyone, for everyone. But spirituality basically concerns itself with relationship. So the first question we need to ask is, what is my relationship with God like? The problem is, when we fill our lives with the noisiness of the busyness of our lives, of going to work, of coming home, of turning on the TV, of being distracted by, I guess we might say the ubiquitous thing called the cell phone. How many of you have cell phones on you right now? Wow. See, everybody. I hope they're turned off. Mine isn't, in case God might call me, but that's different. But isn't it true? A little object like a cell phone keeps us occupied all the time. I'm surprised there's not more accidental deaths because people are walking like this all the time, looking down like this, and I don't know what they're looking for. They might be looking for an answer, but our lives are filled with nonsense. Now, we don't like to admit that, though. And I know I'm in trouble for uttering that word. But seeking out spirituality means that we're willing to set aside time to sit in solitude. Now, that's a scary practice. Let me tell you, it's not an easy practice. Because when we sit in solitude, suddenly the loud voices of our own disconnect seem to invade us loudly, constantly, and once again, our first impression is to let's run away from this. I don't like this idea sitting too quietly because I got to listen to myself. But the amazing thing is, if we sit silently for a while and sort of just be willing to relax our expectations, we open ourselves to God's presence. For the first time, without all the noisiness and busyness around us, we give ourselves opportunity to hear God's voice. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Even I forget that sometimes. Well, I shouldn't say sometimes, oftentimes. But it's amazing. Just yesterday, as I was thinking about the sermon, I happened to be reading over some essays I had written. And I forgot that in the moments of reflection, how powerful words can really become. Because words that have been shaped and influenced by God's voice to us have a beauty of their own. And they often surprise us. They surprise us because we don't always recognize what our capabilities really are. The first thing we begin to understand is that God calls us into relationship. God so wants us to be in relationship. And from that, there's a second thing. Once we begin to understand we are human beings called to live in relationship, in relation to each other and with God, see, there's both that horizontal and vertical nature of what humanity is about. It begins with the vertical relationship where we become open to the presence of God in our lives. But we're not called to be islands unto ourselves. We're called to live with our neighbor. And that doesn't mean the house next door. It means everyone is our neighbor. So the sense that we're led into is that we are called to live in community. Now here again, even as we live in community, we're called to create a space so that God's presence can be felt. See? And how does that occur? One, it's when we quiet ourselves so that we can begin to hear others around us. Just as God created the world with all the glory of the world's diversity, just think, the stories that people tell contain the diversity of how God and their lives intersect. If we are quiet for a moment and open our ears and presence to the other, we're able to hear something that is so important in today's age, and that is we share a common humanity. People feel pain. People feel hurt. People feel ostracized. People have faced happiness and joy. And there's just no one expression for any of those emotions. And so this Lent, I beg you, take time to open yourselves to how God is speaking to you. And take time to listen to those that you come in contact with. Welcome their stories. Let them speak to you. And it's during these times that we might discover a new way of being and a new way of living that does away with all the negatives and divisions that we see today. It's a beginning, but a beginning that is so much needed. Amen.